Welcome to another episode of the Inside Reality. I'm Jimmy Tran, along with my co-host Jeffrey Candelaria. We're excited to be here another time, another place, and then continue the conversation to really dig deep into the inner workings of our world, our relationships, and so forth, and really come to terms with some of the what we call naked observations of culture, of dynamics of relationships and so forth. And so, Jeffrey, good to see you.
Yeah,
Thanks
sure.
for being here.
The quest for truth continues.
Yes.
And we dare to at least take a peek at it because, like Friedrich Nietzsche, I'm not a subscriber to anything called ubiquitous universal truth. I don't really think it exists. I think it's parochial. I think truth is based on perspective and it's subject to space and time. And I think we're going to talk about that. But occasionally on this program, we dare to peek at what you call universal truth.
Yeah, and we dare to ask the questions as well, and that's really the big thing, right? I mean, so right now, I mean, if you really think about it, the science is really about asking questions, okay? Yeah. And then building hypothesis, and then going out and trying to prove it, right? That's the scientific method in a nutshell.
Based on Francis Bacon, I think, the methodology of the scientific method. But let's remind our readers or our listeners or our viewers, rather, what today's about. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. Is America racist? Fundamentally racist? Is there such a thing as American values? And we're going to talk a little bit about astrophysics.
Yeah. And the astrophysics that we want to talk about, more on the side of, I think it's related in the sense that there are institutions and there's gatekeepers of those institutions, right? Whether it's medical, whether it's scientific and so forth. And so there are times when those institutions kind of becomes the gatekeeper. And I think that's related to...
It's the Trump effect, okay? He's disrupting. Just like Einstein disrupted Newtonian physics,
correct,
and on. And Newtonian physics disrupted Ptolemaic physics.
Sure.
And people had cottage industries and institutions built around those theories and made zillions of dollars. And it's like anything else. People do what's in their selfish self-interest, notwithstanding the right thing to do.
And I think that is a type of racism. I'm going to put that in quote because to me that it stems from the same thought, is basically the idea of kind of like protectionism and tribalism that we've talked about, right? I mean, so when we break down society and break down history, what we find very interesting is that countries are formed and rallied around different ideologies, but more specifically, they're driven largely by ethnic groups. Okay. A really good example of that is what we're seeing today playing out in Ukraine. Again, I'm not here to give any kind of political, position or anything like that. But if you look at Ukraine, you can see that Ukraine is a country that has two very distinct ethnic groups that are really, in a way, at war with each other. Very similar to the whole Kosovo, Yugoslavia, and the and that Serbia kind of battle that happened, back in, I think it was the 90s or something like that, right? So it's very similar. So when you have these different ethnic groups, there's a lot of tension that occurs, whether the lines or the boundaries are drawn along religious line or ethnic line. That is where a lot of times you have the tension. Okay, you see that throughout the Middle East. You see that throughout, anywhere. Even in local communities, and so. Racial to me is just one of those dimensions that are derived very similar from that same.
Yeah, but you're missing a very, very obvious set of circumstances and resources and infrastructure and all that. And here's the obvious thing you're not talking about. And again, this is Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria, and the producer and co-host is Jimmy Tran. It's a very provocative show where we dare to talk about truth and take a peek at it. And I don't care. I'm a Republican. He's a Democrat. It doesn't matter. We're not talking about that. We're looking underneath through critical thinking. What is truth based on a particular topic? So to your point, about racism and protecting the ethnicity behind the race, it also is important to factor in those societies throughout history. If you don't command resources, if you don't command food supply, if you don't command water, if you don't command infrastructure, you don't exist as a tribe.
Correct.
That's what wars are all about.
Yeah.
It's a coupling of protecting me because I'm Hispanic, and people that look like me are superior to you. I'm being facetious.
Sure.
But
No,
it is
yeah,
that. But it's also, we commanded the horse, we commanded the rifle, we commanded metalworks. That's why we wiped out the Indians when we came to what is now New Mexico in 1598. Don't get mad. I'm just saying we had technologies that the other opposers or foes did not have. So when people go to war, it's not just because people think they're superior based on their ethnicity and protecting their race because we're superior. You know, the eugenic kind of logic or mindset. But it's also, we're protecting the resources we've already orchestrated.
Yeah.
Because now we have distribution of food. Now we have access to that river. Now we have access to infrastructure, and we've put in play infrastructure. And so that's another thing people don't talk about when it comes to war. It's not just the eugenics of race and superiority of my tribe because we look better than you, but it's also we've orchestrated resources, and we don't want anybody to screw around with that. And we want your resources, by the way.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, and that's really what we see throughout history, right? I mean, you have different group. The stronger group is going to want to attack or take over a weaker group, especially if, let's say, that weaker group is along the riverbed. You know, I mean, they want control of that river because they want, you know, so those are the type of, you know, which is why sometimes even rivers
want
are
their
nice.
Technology. It's superior technology.
Or they want
the Comanches here in what is now the New Mexico part of the world, commandeered horses that we Hispanics like me brought 400 years ago. Once they were able to command horsemanship, they became fierce, raiders. You know, the Comanche, I think they're the Apache as well. But I don't know if you're aware of the Comanches were extremely skilled horsemen, but they didn't have that technology called the horse until we Hispanics introduced it. Most people don't even talk about that. They have no idea that this is history.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, that's what happened with the Chinese. The Chinese was the one that invented gunpowder, for instance, right?
That's right.
But the British was the one that took the gunpowder and, you know, I mean, the Chinese were using it for... Yeah, the Chinese were using it for firecrackers and celebrations and stuff. The British took that, from my understanding, the British took that and then, you know, made gunpowder and then turned it into a weapon.
Weaponized
you know, yeah, exactly.
Weaponized it as far as the technology. Incidentally, what was the end of castle production or castle construction in like the 15th century? Do you know what ended castles? Cannon fire.
Cannon fire. Yeah, that's right.
Cannon fire. Because castles were, impervious to any. Yes,
pretty much.
Until, because arrows and throwing rocks. Give me a freaking break. But once you had the cannonball, you basically could just wipe it out.
Yep.
And make it a castle. No longer had that fortress-like benefit.
Yep.
And it was your Chinese gunpowder that provided the technology that provided the cannonball and on and on and on.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. Okay, I want to clarify one thing. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican.
Whatever the hell it is. I'm just saying.
I'm an independent-minded thinker.
We're not stuck to dichotomizing. The fact that I am a Republican very reluctantly, that does not attach me to the dogma of the stupid conservative Republican Party.
Yeah.
I have liberal thoughts too, and I have independent thoughts, mostly conservative, but I'm not attached to a stupid political party. And that's one of the issues with this damn country is we play this zero-sum game. Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose, and the effect is you have a net zero gain.
Yep.
This dichotomized binary thinking. I can't stand that.
And not only that, one other side and why I chose to stay independent, and I'm not even a registered independent. I'm just an independent, meaning that I don't have any affiliation, and that's because I I look at the idea, I look at the person, I look at all these different things before I decide which direction I want to go with it. And oftentimes I find that the decision isn't easy, for one, and secondly, I you know it, the craziest thing is that I have people that are so party loyal that even if you show them or explain and demonstrate that that's a really bad policy, they don't care because that's their man, that's their woman or whatever, and that's what they're going to go with because that's the party's choice. And to me, that's a sad way of making good, sound and decisions that are going to help. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean that type of strategy is good when you want to accumulate and culminate power, right? I mean, if you want to be able to have the ability to shift and move, I mean, you got to get the numbers in there because in a democratic system, that is what you have to do. You got to get more people rallied around you, and therefore that's why, like, if you have all these people that are Democrat versus Republican, then now you have the majority, which means you can enact policy that and so we're definitely seeing all that, as opposed to people actually giving thought and paying attention to what the specifics of those policies are and the actual outcome of them, right? We hear people, I don't know about you, but I hear people complain all the time how bad things are, or but they won't choose somebody else, because they think that the people in their party is the only one that can solve that problem.
I think it's worse than that. Again, this is Jeffrey Candelaria, Jimmy Tran. You're listening to or watching Inside Reality, where we dare ask questions and peek at truth. Because I don't think there's universal truth. I just think it's a function of where you live and where you're at in space and time. But occasionally we can see ubiquitous truth. So I think the bigger problem,
and I'm on the other side where I think that there is an absolute truth, and no,
I don't believe in that at all. But anyway, the bigger issue for me in the United States and New Mexico is emblematic and a microcosm of the real issue. It's not the fat donut eating politicians who are self-aggrandizing and making policy that they don't have to live with. It's not that. Yeah, that's the problem. That is a problem. But the bigger problem is the population itself is ignorant, lazy, doesn't engage in critical thinking, is not exercising the obligation to be a citizen in this country, which requires, or did at least at one point require, particularly in the Roman Republic. That's why I have Julius Caius Caesar, although he ended up ending the Republic. But the Republic as we knew it for 500 years in the Roman Empire, actually, it was the Roman Republic. The empire came a little later. Operated pretty well for 500 years because Roman citizens had the obligation to be aware of issues, of policies, and the people that were personifying those policies. Did you know in the Senate 2,500 years ago, the senator had to put forth and promulgate his policy in front of the public.
Yeah.
And then the tribune was the conduit between the Senate and the Assembly. The Assembly was the democratic part of the Republic. The Senate was the aristocracy, and the councilship, 2 councils that served for a year, was the executive branch. But anyway, the assemblies were made up of, I think, 4 huge groups. And it required 97 votes for the assembly to actually make policy. Most people don't realize in the Republic, talking about the Roman Republic, right? The Senate did not make policy. They argued for policy.
Sure.
The point is, what I love about the Roman Republic is the Roman citizens had the responsibility of being aware of who they were voting for, what policy they were voting for, and how it affected them, and on and on and on. Today, the average American is dumber than a rock, is not interested in politics, is not interested in policy making, doesn't understand our governance, and is distracted, and I don't think even cares. Yeah. All they do, they just complain, but they're not interested. That's the problem. Yeah. It's not just the donut-eating fat politician that hasn't driven a car in 40 years because they get a limo everywhere they go, they don't have to pay for anything. Somebody gets them a Starbucks latte every morning, and they live in a bubble. Can't stand either party in any of that. I don't like any of it. But the bigger problem is the people. We, the people, ignorant, lazy, not interested, distracted. There are more people that know more about LeBron James than can tell you about, for example, World War II or the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
That's
right.
the issue.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
Well, I mean, we are in a participation society, right? I mean, in terms of our governance system, so that's why I like to use the analogy of the family, because really, if you look at the family construct, okay, the family construct actually brilliantly lays out the different governance model from tyranny to essentially freedom, okay? And if you look at it, you'll see that from the moment of birth, you have literally a tyranny that is in control of you 24/7. Part of it is because of necessity, right? I mean, you're just born, whatnot. You're not going to know, and you're not going to be able to make decisions and so forth. And so therefore, the tyranny is needed in order to at least benevolently bring about better life for you. Now, I understand that not everybody, and that's not a perfect model, but I think this is the best model to illustrate this, right? But as you age, as you mature, right, you enter into what's called free agency, where you then get to decide and choose and so forth, right? As you get older, I mean, there's this whole concept that they call, more freedom comes with more responsibility, right? I mean, that's part of that whole idea. So as you become more mature and more responsible, you get more freedom. I mean, now, of course, in our society, the age of majority is at 18. So at point of that shift, you now have full agency to do whatever you want to do with your own, everything, the consequence of everything lays upon you from whatever you do from that point forward, right? It's arbitrary in a sense, but it's also what we use as a marker. And so when you look at that, you can see that when you have government that operates like a father or mother of an infant, right? You have tyranny. Okay, if you take that same thing and analogous and apply that to society, right? Governance, you get the same thing, right? Government. This is something that I tell people all the time is that what we have here as a constitutional republic is really we have a modified monarchy. We actually, that's what we have. That's why we only have one executor. Okay, and that one executive is the only one that controls and runs everything. And this is the part that people don't understand. Yeah. The only part of the government that is a quote-unquote democracy is relegated to the House and partly in the Senate, like you're saying, with the Roman, because that's the model. We borrow that from the Greeks and then from the Romans and so forth. And so that's the model. And so when we don't understand that, then we say, oh, this person is behaving that way. Yes, because that's their role. Now, of course, they're constrained because they don't get to define policy, or not policy, the law itself, because that was stripped away from the market, right? Traditional monarchy gets to define the law, enact the law, and then judge on the law. The executive only gets to execute on the law. All the other functions of the law is delegated to the other two branches, and that hence separation of power. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, your model about the family tyranny, I think from a mechanical sense, I get that. It's kind of a framework to give an infant sustenance and functionality. But the problem with that model is, I forget what the percentage is, but I know the percentage of blacks in densely populated cities only have a mother in the household.
Yeah.
So now you have a patriarchy. Not a matriarchy.
Yep.
Not a patriarchy. And those unfortunate populations are also woefully undereducated, underhoused, all that. I don't even like saying underhoused, but it is what that is. So now you've got that framework going on in that segment of that population. And then you have depending on where you live, because this is what I want to argue at some point in this podcast. I don't think there are American values, because I think values are a product of where you live, what time frame you're in, and how much resource you have, and also your economic station. So values in the Middle Ages are much different than they are today versus the 1800s during the Gilded Age versus the pre-Civil War period versus post-World War II versus the Roaring 20s. So I don't believe there's this. That's why the Republicans, especially under Trump, and I like Trump in a certain regard. I voted for him twice. But he's always like, with the flags and the patriarch or the patriotism. I don't know what that means. I think you could be a patriot if you're middle class or above, you have resources, you have health, and you have access to some freedom because you have time. But if you're a homeless person living in, San Diego, don't get mad. I'm not advocating for homelessness, but freedom means a very different thing to that person than a middle class or an upper middle class or a wealthy person. So those values are going to be extraordinarily different.
Well, I think that there's a little bit there too. I mean, the fact that we can freely choose to be homeless is part of that freedom, I guess, in my mind, right? If we choose to not have the encumbrance of all the
So you're saying that
trappings of
100% of all homeless people across the country
I'm not saying that they're
have chosen to
no,
be
I'm not saying
in
that
that
they're
position?
chosen to be there. I'm just saying that we do have that we should have that right to choose that option if we want, right? Not everybody. I'm not saying that that's where they're. I mean, each person there that are homeless right now are there for various circumstances. I get that. I'm not talking about that.
Right.
I'm just saying that from a pure, just like pure freedom allows us to say what we want. I can say what I want whenever I want and do whatever I want and so forth.
Not really. No, I don't think so.
Again, I'm
a white person at a bank that makes $1 zillion a month can't say, "Gee whiz, I don't like every black person I meet." If he said that, he'd be fired. So there's no free speech in America. That'll be another podcast.
Yeah,
there's
I get that.
Free speech. That's a myth.
Well, we regulate things. I mean, we don't like the consequence of what we say as a result. I mean, just like things that are happening right now. We're having this conversation, right? I know that there are some people, and if you are happy to hear what you want to say, drop it in the comments, right? We want to hear from you if you disagree with what we're saying, or if you agree, that's fine. That's great too, and you have the freedom to do so. I might not agree with you, and of course, if I'm the one in control, I can even delete what I can choose to censor, if you will, or disregard whatever. If
I think you've made the point. Keep going on with
correct.
Your point. Go on with your point.
So what I'm getting at is that we have what I know that the term values is not necessarily the best term. I think that it's principles. I think is much better term than values.
Convictions and principles.
Yeah. So in the United States, there is a very definitive set of principles that we go by. One of them that we always throw around is we're a democracy, right? The democratic process, if you will, or whatever that means. And people, of course, have different ideas and what that means and how that is implemented. But the idea of majority gets to choose for what happens, right? That's a fundamental principle of the United States that are different. I mean, you don't get that option at home
unless you insert the electoral college into the equation, and that doesn't always work.
How it functions is it's another matter, and there's reasons why certain things are there, but we can dissect all that in a moment. But my point is that we have this principle, what we call democracy, and therefore, you get to vote, you get to choose what it is. If you don't choose, then somebody's going to choose for you. Now, there's also another set of principles that are there, and that's called the principle of life. Your life cannot be threatened by that majority decision. Okay, for instance, I like the illustration that I heard. I think
unless
I heard
you're
it on
Jewish at an Ivy League school.
Well,
then you could be threatened.
Well,
what does Harvard do to protect
okay.
Jewish populations that are trying to go to their final, appointment to, conclude their finals term paper or whatever.
How it gets played out and the
But that's the
mechanism.
problem with this kind of thinking is we throw around these words like, oh, the American way, and we're patriotic and we believe in the democracy. People don't even participate in our democratic system.
Well, that's
Look at the voter
in itself.
turnouts.
Yeah, agree.
They're 12%, 30%, 40%. And we're not even talking about people that could vote but don't even attempt to register to vote. So
agree.
the democracy here is a myth. And I want to go back to what you said about this whole free speech thing. If you're a transgender and you're whatever the hell you are, and you're on CNN, you can say whatever the hell you want with impunity.
Yeah.
But if you're a white person, you make a lot of money, and you're a billionaire, do you think those two people could say the same thing with impunity? Hell no. So this myth about free speech, it's bull crap.
You're right.
And this whole thing that we live in a democratic system, no, we don't. There's only a few people relative to a few people. Let me rephrase that. There is only a fraction of those that could potentially participate in this constitutional republic that do so. And that's why the bureaucrats, the institutional elites, and the fat politicians know that. So they manipulate the fact that most people are just ignorant, lazy, not paying attention, and not participating. So I disagree with you almost in the most with as much zeal as I can provide.
I don't think we.
The problem is the population itself. It's not the system. It's not the fat donut eating politician. It's the people. That's why we're doomed. That's why we're doomed.
I agree with you. Okay, let me put it that way. And what you're saying is definitely a good observation on what has transpired in our society. What I'm talking about has nothing to do with on one level, it has nothing to do with what the reality of how it gets implemented and how it gets, properly. I'm just talking about the principle, the purest level of the idea, right, of freedom of speech, for instance, or freedom of religion. Yes, I understand that there are constraints to all those things when it comes to the practice of it, right? And what you're talking about is that in practice, there is no such thing as freedom of speech. And so I get that.
I'm a practical guy.
Absolutely. I'm just talking about principally that is what we're supposed to strive for that, right? Just like, to me, that's why when I look at the Declaration of Independence, and it says, an inalienable right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's just saying that you get those three things irrespective of who you are, period. Okay, that's the vision, if you will, of our American values, or more specifically, American principles. Okay, now how that gets implemented and all that, obviously, is going to vary. If you're in a community, I can assure you that if you're in a community, like right now, if you were in Dearborn, Michigan, right, you're going to have a very different experience when it comes to life, liberty, and happiness than you are, like you say, in San Diego,
Absolutely.
California.
I said that earlier.
Exactly.
Values
and that's
are a function of where you live, what resources you have, what is your economic station, and what space and time do you live.
Of course. But the principles are still applicable in both places because we're here in the United States. That's very different than if we're in Mexico City or in Alberta, Canada.
I think liberty and freedom meant something very different if you were a peasant living under the feudalistic model in England.
Yeah.
In the 13th century, liberty is going to mean a lot something else. If you were a Native American Iroquois, that until 1924 you weren't even allowed citizenship.
No. Again,
so under this flag, and I'm a Republican saying this, I can't believe it. Under the United States flag, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act. You had blacks being looked at as 3/5 of a human being. Women couldn't vote till 1920. Mexicans weren't even seen as able to participate in segregated schools in California till 1930 or something like that. Indians weren't allowed citizenship till 1924. So So what? So where does your symbol of freedom and liberty
Well,
look like there?
Well, I'm not saying that it was all implemented properly and best or whatever.
Oh,
And that's really why you have amendments
really?
yeah. Again, to me,
I'm being
a vision is
sarcastic,
well,
obviously.
well, to me, what I see is that there was a vision that was cast before us as far as what we would like to see take
A
place.
vision for the aristocrat,
Well,
white English
well,
founders.
again,
You didn't see any blacks. You didn't see any Indians. You didn't see any women.
Okay.
And again,
No,
I think this is a
I
great
get-
country and all that.
I know,
But let's
that's
be
fine.
honest about it. Come on, man.
I'm not saying that. Okay, those are the circumstances of those, because that's the people that were in charge. Okay, if this whole thing happened in China, let's say same scenario of what we saw that happened in the early days, 1776 and so forth, but it happened in China, I could assure you that the Chinese, whoever the dominant ethnic group of the Chinese, the Han Chinese, would be the one. You go to Africa, you have the same, let's say if it was implemented in the same way in Africa somewhere, you would have the same thing. Whatever the dominant party is going to have whatever the system that the dominant party and the dominant group has in place. But that's not the same thing as when you have a vision. A vision means that you're casting something that you're hoping for and espousing to achieve. Obviously, we've seen that. To me, that is actually the whole system
Then why
working.
weren't women given the right to vote? Why did it take 150
Well, then
years?
but they eventually, but they were
it took
eventually
150
given.
years after the vision was implemented.
Okay. Well, that's
And you're
just
making my point, Jenny. I've said this from the beginning. Again, you're listening to Inside Reality. People, the human condition, I don't care where the hell you're at,
yeah.
does what is in their self-interest.
Absolutely. That is
selfishly.
the part. That is part of the
Selfishly. It
correct.
doesn't matter. Everybody does what's in their
Correct.
self-interest, and they do it selfishly. It's
And they do it for
very rare-
themselves. Correct.
It's very rare that you have a true altruistic person.
Yeah.
Very rare.
Yeah, and even then, I mean, you have to take care of yourself. I mean, that's just part of
Well,
the
Maslow
laws of
said
nature.
Maslow said if you're not safe and healthy, you can't do anything. I get all that.
Exactly. So that is part of the first function. Now, of course, the next level of function is then within the family. Your parents, your siblings, and so forth. And then, or if you're the parent, then you have your children and all. So, to me, when we start to govern from the inside out, okay, that's when we have success in society and in life. When we try to control everybody and everything else, that's when we have a lot of chaos.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
what we're seeing.
Well, the
is
breakup
that nobody's
the
in
breakup
our last
of the
episode
the breakup of the nuclear family
is detrimental.
what doomed our country.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we're going back because
No.
it true now that more than first of all, people aren't getting married as they did before.
Yeah.
Overall, I guess the United States population is declining.
Correct.
And thirdly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the divorce rate is more than 50%. I still think that's true.
Yes, that
so
is
now
still
you have
correct.
single parent families, and partly that's because of economic stresses and all of that. But the breakup of mom, dad, teaching their children, you called it tyranny, but the culture of what I call mores, civility, a sense of pride in your brand, a sense of community where they live,
Yeah.
and most importantly, and I don't think this really happened, but I'd like to think it did. So here I am being idealistic. I can't believe it because I'm cynical as hell. Teaching your kids morals and ethics.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't happen.
correct.
That does not happen. They get their morals and ethics here,
Yeah. Or in their school
or the group they're with.
groups they're with. Yeah, exactly.
And that's why I keep making the same point. The problem with America, democracy, and the constitutional republic, and the fat politician, whether he's Pelosi or Trump or Schumer, whatever the hell they are, it's not them. Yes, it is them, but it's us. We the people.
Yeah.
We lack civility, we lack education, we lack critical thinking, we lack discipline, we lack mores, we lack a sense of ethics and morals.
Yeah.
That is why we're doomed.
Yes.
And that's
You
what
are-
that's what we're doomed this guy behind me.
Yes.
And what was called the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And we know this because we've seen it happen historically, but also our enemy, a lot of our enemies or people that are our adversaries, if they're not enemies, they know this as well, which is one of the reasons why they stoke this. I mean, part of the reason why you have such a fracturing within the black community, for instance, you mentioned that earlier.
Got 10 minutes, by the way.
Yeah. So the reason why that happened was because there was an attempt by those that were running things to literally disenfranchise and break up the family, because they knew that if they were to stay strong in the black community, that they would outpace.
Well, they would have been a dominant population within the framework of the white population.
Yeah.
So the white population decided let's screw up the black population with drugs and break up their families.
Correct. And there's a very concerted
and that way we depower them.
Yes.
Without them knowing it. But yet they think that all these little crumbs that we're getting from the government, they actually thought that was a good thing.
Exactly. We also seen that with the Native American. That's why we see that happening. I mean, so throughout history, we've seen different groups doing that. And that's part of the problem. This is one of the reasons why I do not like the Democratic Party and their, part from some of their origin, of their party, and also a lot of the policies, because when you favor trying to give to a group, you overgive and you end up with a problem. I mean, the other part that I do like about the Democratic Party at times is the compassion that I see. It feels like they do have.
Oh, come on!
But I don't know if
compassion.
Well, whether it is or not, I don't want to judge their motives.
A little compassion, but the institutional compassion that they put forth, that's nonsense. I mean, I think there were some. Like, I think RFK would have been a good president. I think he actually had compassion.
There are people
I don't think his brother John had the compassion that RFK did.
Definitely,
as one small example.
Yeah.
But this, this like I own more. The reason I can't really stand most of the liberal Democratic Party is they assume that they own morality.
That's it right there.
That just like really upsets the hell out of me, because no one owns morality. It is a thing. That's about as close as I'm going to come on this podcast to ever saying that there is a universal truth. Because I'm going to almost be Immanuel Kant here and quote the categorical imperative when he talked about there are certain moral positions that are absolutely immutable. That's as close as I'm ever going to come. By the way, what other podcast does somebody quote categorical imperative? Categorical imperative. Does not happen. All right, man. We got about 5 minutes on Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candler, and this is Jimmy Tran. There is not another podcast like this, by the way.
Yeah, and you love what we're doing, please support us. We have Patreon. We're going to get up other options for you to be able to support us as well. Some of our merchandise and so forth. And one of the things we tease on this, and I want to touch on a little bit, and we can come back to this in a different episode. But a couple of days ago, I came across, and it's not somebody I knew, but it was just a recent podcast that I saw. It was with Patrick Bet-David and Terrence Howard, and then there was Dr. Yu from NASA. Anyway, and they were having this really interesting discussion. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, aside from the whole scientific part of it, and I want to send that to you so that you can take a look at it and we can have a much deeper conversation on that. But the part that was really interesting and what was brought up was the fact that here's a guy who has no credentials. His background is in acting and so forth, but he's a super smart guy. He come up with a very, very unique perspective on physics and so forth, and he can't get the scientific community to pay attention to him. Even though he has shown through his work that, he can solve, using his methodology and the framework that he laid out, can solve the three-body problem, the seven-millennial problem, and so forth. But nobody wants to take that on to evaluate whether
it's very simple. What do I keep saying? People do what's in their self-interest,
of course,
and they protect their power.
Absolutely,
so he's disrupting the framework of physics, just like Einstein in 1912, 1920 with his general and special theories of relativity. Do you think he was welcomed in the Newtonian framework of physics? Hell no.
Yeah.
Do you think the Impressionists Monet, Renoir, all those guys were welcomed in the world of art in Paris at that time? No. What do you think Trump is welcomed by the Republicans or the Democrats because he's disrupting the framework of economics, import, export? No. People do what's in their self-interest. So this guy you're citing, and we'll talk about it further because I happen to know a little bit about astrophysics, he's disrupting all these people who have positions of power.
Absolutely, yeah.
In the former framework that gravity is king in the world of physics.
Yes.
So it doesn't surprise me at all. I keep coming back to what I always say. People do what's in their self-interest, and they protect their power.
So I'm gonna lay something out on that regard.
We got 1 minute.
All right. So from that type of construct, to me, that is the conservative position versus the liberal position, which is the challenge of that status quo, right? So that's the reason why when you label people one way or the other, you never get them right because that shifts. Right now, we're in a world where, in a sense, the liberal position of 50, 60 years ago is now the kind of the conservative position today, in a sense.
Sort of.
You know, because society has changed, a lot of things have evolved and so forth and so forth. Anyway, and that's what you're talking about.
That's a good point because I do have an issue, and I am a reluctant Republican. Can't even say it out loud, but and I am more conservative overall. If you put a gun to my head, I'm like 56% conservative, whatever. But what I don't like about conservatism, based on the way you promulgated it and espoused it and put it forth, I don't want to go back 50 years when I would watch My Three Sons, which I enjoyed with Fred McMurray. But you never saw a Chinese guy unless he was like a laundry guy. You never saw a Hispanic guy ever. If you saw anybody that sort of looked like me, it was a Mexican guy doing the freaking lawn.
Sure.
You never saw any women with power. So I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to, and I've said this before, Muhammad Ali in 1967. He's a world champion. He can't go to Louisville, Kentucky, and have a meal at a white restaurant. I don't want to go back to that. So you have to be careful when you hear "Make America Great Again." You got to be careful with some of that because
absolutely
the again part it can be pretty disruptive. It wasn't until 1964 that blacks didn't have access to all the equalities that other races had in this country.
Absolutely,
that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, well, and any and every one of those things. We have to be careful about,
even as a conservative, and I have to be very careful here because I want to conserve certain parts.
That's key,
and that's the part that we'll talk about maybe next time. We talked about it earlier: personal accountability, responsibility, get off your ass. Make something happen. Participate in your own dreams. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria. Jimmy Tran.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.
Jeffrey, real quick.
Inside Reality.
Yeah. Real quick on that is that when you're saying you're conservative, what are you conserving? That's what you're saying that you got to answer.
We'll talk about that
if you're saying you're a liberal, what are you trying to challenge in terms of the status quo?
We'll talk
because
about that.
You can't just do this broad.
If I had to synthesize it, it would be I'm trying to conserve a sense where it was an ideal that people had personal responsibility,
absolutely,
accountability, life's not fair, get over it, and optimize whatever I am to my fullest potential.
Absolutely.
And that's not happening in America for the most part.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day. Leave your comment, like, subscribe, and follow us. We'll see you again next time. Another episode of Inside Reality.